This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we do bring you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing, with discussions on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. And this week, we are pleased to welcome back Alton Johnson. He was here last episode speaking to us about the importance of the Internet of Things and integrating technologies and how to get an ROI on that. And we wanted to invite him back this week to talk a little bit more about some of the real life applications of these technologies. So, we spent a great deal of time speaking about the walls and bridges on the way to building a smart pharmaceutical, biotech, or device company. And I think it's appropriate, Alton, to speak some this episode about pilot programs, test companies out there, some smart labs that we've seen going up. So to best illustrate the ways in which IoT impacts companies in a variety of different ways, let's consider the product lifecycle that pharma and device professionals are so familiar with, starting with stage one of the lifecycle, new product development. Which is the research, the introduction, that kind of stuff. How have you seen, Alton, IoT and AI technologies used successfully in this particular part of the life cycle?
So just to start, I like to look at the life cycle in terms of the FDA guidance on validation that was issued January of 2011. And it actually lays out the stages of the life cycle very nicely. Stage one is development. Stage two is the registration and commercial launch. And stage three is the continued process verification. After we go to commercial stage of the product. So I'd like to provide an example in each of those areas. So let's start with development.
Excellent.
Prior to getting into development, during development stage of new products, one of the key limitations, especially at the early stage, is we have limited prior knowledge of this particular product and process. We have limited material and budget to do the kind of experiments that we would like to run to build the process understanding as quickly as possible. Now, IoT can really help this by making the data and the analytics readily available, even at this early stage. Because first principle models, for example, apply equally to commercial and development processes. They are the same. Mm-hmm. So by capturing the data early on and the information and knowledge in real time, IoT-enabled development frameworks helps us build a product development story. We learn more, we learn faster because we're integrating all of the processes that we need to realize to achieve the end game. A new product launch that's going to have reliable quality and reliable supply. Now, for any continuous operation, whether it's end-to-end continuous or a unit operation like tableting or roller compaction or packaging or device assembly, those continuous processes need to be monitored in real time. We need to understand what's going on at all times. So what we can do with these is study transition states. We don't need to run multiple design of experiments. We can get a lot more information out of very little material in very little time and leverage the power of IoT to speed our development process. Now, I have seen one example where this has occurred. And the example I'd like to use is biological cell culture. Okay. There was a new product. It was preparing for phase 3 to switch into phase 3 clinical studies. And the historical yields varied widely from 50 to 100% of the target. And what that did, it made clinical supply planning very difficult, and it raised the cost of clinical supplies because we had to make more batches. The yields at 50% were a real problem. And furthermore, the commercial viability of this product was essential to keep the cost down, and the higher yield was critical to achieving those cost targets. Sure. So what they did was bring in a manufacturing intelligence team with an IoT approach to capturing data on the process. Now, they knew from development that the rate at which they fed the cells, they could increase the nutrient rate of feed and get faster cell growth. But if they did too much of that, metabolite would build up, poison the cell culture, and shut down production. So the manual approach to optimizing that balance of nutrient feed and metabolite buildup using a traditional approach wasn't successful. So what the team did was design a probe to monitor both. Didn't come in contact with the cell culture, didn't breach sterility, and they were able to take that information, model the growth, and put a control algorithm into that instrument to actually control the nutrient feed to maintain the optimal level of cell growth and metabolite. And as a result, consistently, they got 105% yield. It saved $5 million for the initial phase 3 supply cost. And you can only imagine the tens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars that would be saved at the commercial scale.
Absolutely. That's an amazing number. $5 million just in the production, right? Or the development phase. And in addition to the dollar amount, do you have any idea how much time was saved?
Well, just in terms...
I'm asking you off the cuff, so if you don't, it's okay. I'm just curious.
Just in terms of the number of batches, the time to produce the product probably saved about 60% of the time. It took 60% of the time that it would have taken otherwise.
Right.
So 30% savings.
That's amazing, because oftentimes when we're in drug development or in device development, there's a need out there. Obviously, there's patients in need or consumers in need, and so the faster we can get some of these things to market, the better. So that's amazing. Not only the cost savings, but really the time reduction, I think, is quite remarkable.
And the beauty of this system, we got a couple of surprises when this was implemented. It was independent of cell line. It could work on any cell line. Oh, wow. And in addition to that, it worked at any scale. So the entire portfolio of new products and marketed product could be optimized as needed with one tool, which is a real huge benefit. You don't expect that, right. But it was a big win for the overall company that put this into place.
Absolutely. No, it sounds incredible, because it's not only great for this one product that they were in development with, but it sounds like they were able to use it for all of their products, which is going to obviously save money and time across the board. So a big win there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When we consider the next stage then, so you talked about development, when we consider the next stage where we're really looking at scaling up or product growth, there's many ways that technology can aid manufacturing efficiencies, stability, shelf life testing, packaging, distribution processes. And you had noted a great case study when I was speaking with you, for which new organic synthesis process benefited from IoT. So can you share a little bit more about that with our listeners?
Yes, and this is a really exciting case study. It really demonstrates the power of IoT. Simulations using the digital twin approach, data analytics, and model predictive control actually came together through an IoT-like process to rescue a failed scale-up process.
Okay.
So the purpose of this scale-up process was to demonstrate suitability for registration and launch. Again, stage 2 validation. And the existing commercial process that this new process was replacing required 6 reaction steps, took about 25% of a huge manufacturing site's capacity. This capacity was needed for other things. The other thing, this drug would eventually go off patent at loss of exclusivity. It was important to drive down the cost. So through some really innovative, newly invented chemistry, they came up with a two-step process. It only took about 6% of the site's capacity. So all of a sudden, without any additional capital investment, this site generated almost 20% excess capacity for products, and they avoided a capital investment. But what happened, they had already built the savings in.
Sure.
They were planning on both the capacity and the cost savings. And it had one of the two reactions was highly exothermic, happened really, really fast. And when they scaled it up, it needed exquisite temperature control, plus or minus a half degree Celsius. Upon scale up, the heat exchange or the cooling capacity of that reactor was not fast enough. And so they failed. The product wasn't produced, and lots of impurities were produced instead. So
that's unfortunate.
It really is, because some of the brightest organic chemists and chemical engineers in the world, but they just didn't have the right equipment to be able to run the process. So they tried it again with every possibility. They had every tool in their toolkit with the existing equipment, and they just weren't able to fix the process. So they called in an advanced manufacturing team to evaluate. And the first thing they did was model the reactor.
Sure.
And with a digital twin, simulated it, and quickly determined that the cooling capacity and the rate of heat exchange, or cooling and heat exchange, was too low, and you absolutely couldn't do it with this equipment. So then it was either acquire new equipment, redesign equipment. What they ended up finding was a cryogenic reactor at another site. So they actually switched the manufacturer to another site that was approved. And again, using a digital twin approach, modeled that cryogenic reactor, and it was affected. It did have the rate of heat exchange or heat extraction to be able to do that. So then, using digital twin simulation principles, they modeled that reactor with solvent only, and it performed as it was intended, and they were able to fine-tune some of the process parameters. Then they repeated first run with active, a GMP batch, and it ran perfectly. In fact, the yield was higher than any yield they'd ever had, even on lab scale, and the lowest impurity. So it was a real win. So they went from a totally impossible situation through IoT, digital twin, intelligence technology, bringing that together. Very quickly, we're able to find a solution and put the project back on track with just a short delay.
Excellent. I'm happy to hear that. That's amazing results. And I'm sure they were sweating it out at the time.
All of us were, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it just goes to show that not only was the Internet of Things very important here in terms of figuring this out quickly, and keeping them not too far off track, budgetary speaking. But also to your point earlier of just using your resources, right? So going out there, they had the team figure out where the issues were, where the problem was, and then going to another site to find that cryogenic technology was the saving grace, right? And thankfully they had it at their ready, and it was the piece that brought the result they were looking for ultimately.
Yeah, and speaking to the topic of virtual collaboration that we talked to in part one,
right?
Just to reemphasize here, some of those simulations were actually done in the U.S. and the manufacturing site was in Europe.
Nice.
So a lot of this work could be done remotely. In fact, as some of the experiments were being run, the monitoring and control was being done from the team that happened to be in the U.S. So there was full collaboration across the Atlantic. Of course, a lot of the work was done on site, but some of the stuff, preparative work, could be done without being on site. And that was a huge advantage because that allowed the project to move much more quickly.
Right. It keeps it moving quickly, and it keeps the cost down too, because you're not paying for people to fly back and forth and put them up at hotels and all of the other expenses, right? That goes with being in person. So, I mean, really technology's at work all the way around. So of course, once we reach the third stage, we're really focused on the optimization of our manufacturing, our supply chain, and the product quality. So we're trying to just tweak the next, best things out of it. Can you give us a few examples of the value of emerging technologies on this area of the life cycle?
So yes, I mean, the power of IoT, the data it provides, and the big data analytics that you can do with that data really creates a lot of powerful business advantages across the life cycle. So if we look at the end-to-end supply chain, generally first, things like real-time demand forecasting, demand planning, and scheduling have enabled intelligent operations. So things like real-time demand, translating that into what we do on the manufacturing floor, for example. It also goes to things like predictive maintenance of equipment to reduce the downtime, real-time monitoring and intervention in a cold chain distribution, for example, so we avoid product loss, quality trending to identify sources of loss or waste, predictive quality assessments can often enable interventions before things go wrong. Some of the reporting even can be automated. And then in addition, we can expand our product and process understanding by these retrospective quality assessments that are available to us because we have the data and the data analytics in this IoT platform. So I guess one of the things I would like to point out here is, what are we going for ultimately?
Right.
And really what we're trying to do is to harness the complementary power of data, of models, engineering, and IT infrastructure to really change the paradigm. We want to transform data into knowledge and intelligence. We want to move from reactive actions to proactive and preventative strategies. This is so important in commercial manufacture. And we need to shift from these standalone and isolated aspects of our supply chain, whether it's process, analytical, engineering, scheduling, whatever, towards a more integrated infrastructure. And this integrated infrastructure occurs at the process. We need that at the plant level, and we also need this at the enterprise level. Now, that all sounds great, but what are the results?
Right. Exactly.
And if we look at industry sources, there are a number of massive benefits, and I've seen these realized in real life. Those cycle time reductions of up to 40%, reduced downtime of up to 35%. Variability is also a big issue in pharmaceutical manufacturing. We have variable inputs, we run fixed processes, and then we have variable outputs. Surprise, surprise. So by being able to modify our process within certain constraints, we can reduce that variability by up to 60%. That's a real pain point in the pharmaceutical industry. An outcome of all of that control, we often get energy savings as well. And those can be up to 30% because we're optimizing the use of our energy by optimizing our process. We get almost a side benefit. And then overall bump in productivity can be as high as 15%. So these are really compelling benefits. So what is the industry waiting for, right?
Right. I know, and I would think that you see a reduction in CAPAs, returns, recalls, removals, right? Because you're catching all of this stuff really before it becomes the major monster that it can be, on the other end, when you are still using manual processes or not fully taking advantage or leveraging the technologies that do exist out there. So I think that that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and I think being able to optimize that quality and our supply reliability is really important. And these solutions really help give us a huge tool lever to get there. I'd like to give one example of a commercial product. It was a local site in a local market that supplied that market. And for import restrictions and pricing and cost and so forth, there was no option to supplement supply external. And on one particular product and one particular line, all of a sudden the demand doubled. And they had a demand for twice as much as they could produce. Now, of course, there was justification to put in capital expansion, but that was going to take a year.
Right.
So the site and an advanced manufacturing team decided to collaborate and see, well, what could we do to squeeze out more throughput? How could we use these advanced tools like IoT and manufacturing intelligence and advanced process control to speed the throughput? So the first thing they did was look at the balance of material through the process. And this was a film-coated tablet. They had wet granulation drying, blending, tablet compression, and film coating. And the first thing they did was map the balance of material through that process to see where the bottlenecks were. And the big bottleneck was pretty obvious. It was drying. The drying times varied all over the place depending on how wet the material was coming in, how well the equipment drying capacity was performing that day, and there was one fixed process. Furthermore, the input had to be assessed by taking a physical sample. So you had to stop the process, take a physical sample, run off and understand what the loss on drying was, and come back, run it some more, and then test again until you got to the required loss on drying. So it was
very cumbersome, Alton. It sounds very cumbersome.
Very cumbersome, very manual, and pretty frustrating because you get about 35% variability from your best drying time to the worst. So the first thing they did was they put a probe in, so they could interface a probe with the material to see what the moisture was. And then with that, they also built a soft sensor to actually calculate the amount of moisture, which was more accurate than the probe.
Right.
So you could actually calculate the result. And then they built a control system built with high fidelity models, soft sensors, and optimality seeking algorithms so that the drying could follow that golden batch trajectory regardless of the starting point. The process parameters could be changed within regulatory limits to optimize that. As a result, they cut out 35% of the time it took to dry. So that means 35% more through the same piece of equipment.
Right.
Once they solved that problem, where was the next bottleneck? Well, it was tableting. And talking to the operations folks, some tablet operations could be run at maximum speed, so that helped the throughput. But a lot of the batches the compression rate had to be slowed down because of flow and compressibility. And through prior knowledge, they knew that this was related to the particle size distribution of that material. Well, to optimize that, they had to go back up all the way up to the wet granulation stage prior to drying. And they added the particle size optimization to that control model and actually optimized the performance of that process end to end across multiple unit operations so they could run the tablet press at maximum speed for every batch. They got an additional 15% throughput.
Wow.
So all of a sudden, without any capital investment, just 2 weeks downtime to put this into place and run the installation and operational qualification and performance qualification, they were able to get a 50% bump in product supply. That's 50% more patients who can be served.
Absolutely.
And for the business, 50% more revenue on that particular product. So it was a huge win. And it was relatively straightforward to put that into place.
That's a great example of leveraging the technologies, right, to see a huge gain with really, I imagine, obviously, there was some investment in the engineering and the time to solve these problems, but they didn't have to take a capital investment and a whole lot more time to build a new manufacturing facility, et cetera, right? They were able to solve and really increase by 50%. That's an amazing number.
Yeah, they did have to take the line down for 2 weeks.
Right.
But the gain they got back was worth the downtime.
Yeah, I would think.
The cash cost was about $25,000. I mean, I'm not counting all the labor and the effort that went into it, but the cash cost to build this system, because the capabilities were internal to that company, they were able to build the models, do the programming, and do the installation and operational and performance qualification. So it doesn't have to be expensive if you have the right skill set.
Right. And they were able to recoup that money, it sounds like, in like 3 weeks, right? Because now their production was 50% faster. So
we love that type of return on investment or net
absolutely. That's good ROI.
Absolutely.
So, Alton, a lot of what we've been discussing in this episode are examples of applications of technologies, and you've been using the life cycle to describe the different stages of the life cycle to describe it. And what we've discussed so far applies to both the product life cycle, as we've seen, as well as the process validation life cycle. And it's interesting that whether we're looking to develop new drugs or launch a new device or make changes to an existing product, let's say, like you've talked about, there are benefits in employing new and innovative technologies and practices. So help us tie all this whole thing together with an end-to-end IoT-enabled validation solution in practice. So now we've talked about different pieces. Let's tie it all together if we can, so that we understand the maximum value that really these technologies bring to the organization across the board.
No, thank you, Stacey. You make a really critical point here. The validation lifecycle management solutions, for example, are inherently complex.
Right.
Just the number of processes alone in the validation ecosystem. So we've got computer systems, equipment qualification, we've got facility and commissioning and qualification, method validation, like all of the analytical methods, cleaning methods, and our process validation. This is a massive amount of work, and it's a massive system to maintain and to operate. And it cuts across drug substance, drug product, the devices, and it's typically really complex.
Right.
Paper-based, it's manual, and it takes a really intensive amount of resource and oversight to make sure the thing works and remains compliant. And firms are really good at this, but it takes a tremendous allocation of effort and resources, and it's not easy to do. So what if we could turn all that into digital?
Right.
And take that burden of administration away from the humans and give it to technology, so the humans could then use the information and optimize the performance of the system. So what would a good validation lifecycle management system do? Well, first, it would cover all 3 stages, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3.
Right.
Next, it would really need to be 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, or the European equivalent or the Japanese equivalent. It would automate the process. It would track compliance to procedures and align with our quality management systems. And it would prompt actions like review and approval of validation documents and related procedure changes in real time. So, for example, if we changed one procedure to improve the process, they would be matrixed in such a way in a validation lifecycle management solution so that it would prompt us to make those modifications in the connected matrix procedures.
Right.
So a lot of the manual work that occurs today that's quite difficult would be automatic, and we would be prompted to do a lot of that work. So I think there are just some tremendous advantages. It would also reduce the resources, and I think that's another big change in that for computer validation, for example,
right,
you can save up to 80% of the labor cost to do a computer system validation. In commissioning and qualification of a new facility, you could get that for probably 20 to 30% less labor. Plus the timeline's faster, and we all know time is money.
Absolutely.
And that validation is it's a necessary thing to complete before we can actually realize the value and start using our facilities or our processes. I'd like to give just a brief case study to illustrate what this means.
That's great.
I'm going to use a major global pharmaceutical company, and they were struggling. They were compliant. They were keeping everything on track. All the trains were running on time, but it was taking a tremendous amount of effort and a tremendous amount of pain. So they looked for a digital solution. What they wanted to start with was 4 sites. and maybe 1,000 users, up to 1,000 users, more like 300. And they were able to implement with a good solution provider a streamlined validation process that was completely digital in 12 weeks. It was phenomenal. And
Wow.
Because the system was so easy to work with, they approved over 10,000 protocols and executed review and approval of 3,000 validation documents in that period of time. It enabled virtual collaboration, visibility, and accountability. These were 4 sites scattered all over the globe, and they were able to coordinate across that and have consistency. It also enhanced document access, and when they were going through audits, they found that their compliance ratings came up significantly because they were able to get the documents and the information very quickly and show that.
That's a huge bonus. Yeah.
It is. It's tremendous. I mean, that's one of the most nerve-wracking things, having hosted pre-approval inspections and regulatory inspections, compliance inspections, to be able to know that you've got that information to show it in real time.
Right. And it takes an incredible amount of time to go through those regulatory audits, right? So knowing that you're prepared because all of your documentation is ready at a moment's notice for you has got to be a huge relief.
Yes, and a huge release of those people who normally manage stacks of paper in a war room, and they have to find on a moment's notice that
Exactly.
paper. This is a matter of a couple of clicks, and you can bring up the approved document, which is phenomenal. And I think the other thing they found with documents could be authored very rapidly because they were actually using templates, and everybody was using the same template. So
it brings consistency too, right? Not only speed, but it sounds like it's bringing a lot of consistency to what people are doing within the organization, right? So if I'm creating documents in San Diego and my counterpart in Geneva is also doing it, we know that there's going to be some standard that we're all using, which is, right. I think, another really key element to technology.
Absolutely. What they also found, the validation cycle time went down by about 50%. So half of what it usually took them to do the validation. And again, time is money, and being able to move more quickly gives us a much better return on our assets.
Sure.
We can move through that more quickly.
I would think that also, these technologies also positively impact our efforts with data privacy, cybersecurity, because I know you mentioned that was one of the key elements that technologies bring. And when you are able to streamline your processes and really have a better handle on everything you're doing in real time, then those numbers go up as well.
Absolutely. And you do make a very important point. There are some real challenges around cybersecurity and data privacy and so forth. And as long as that's built in up front, or you're working with a vendor who knows how to handle that, and you have your internal capabilities, you can bring that together fairly quickly and build a system that gives you the security and data privacy that you need, preventing access from any outside malfeasance, but at the same time allow people to collaborate virtually in real time, regardless of where they are in the world. And this particular company, they expanded next to 15 sites and about several thousand users, I think about 3,000 users. And this has gone so well, they're now in the process of rolling this out globally to every site they have, over 50 sites, over 20,000 users, and they'll all be on one platform and working to the same sheet of music, so to speak. So this is a phenomenal win for this company. And the amount they're saving and the effectiveness of how they do their work is just phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like they really are the poster child for this, right? And it's where we all hope to be eventually when as we move to more fully integrated organizations. So I'm really impressed with that. That's amazing. And it can be recreated, it sounds like. I mean, all of these organizations who are developing different protocols and different solutions and really doing a lot of the research up front, it benefits them, obviously, in what they've done in the ways that you've mentioned, but it really benefits the entire industry. And it puts more resources out there, more knowledge out there for all of the pharma device companies, et cetera, right? I mean,
that's a great point. I mean, turnover is higher in some areas, some global areas than others. And in the business environment today, in the rate of change, there's turnover. We can't count on someone being in validation for 30 years anymore. A lot of them will likely move on to other opportunities.
Right.
It's the nature of business today. So by automating some of this, you're much less dependent on a critical person leaving the organization and having to recoup and capture what they know,
right.
Or recreate it in the worst case. All of this stuff is online and available, to your point. And I think that's a really important thing to consider with these digital solutions.
Yeah, I would agree. And so, I mean, you have built a very compelling story, really, today for our listeners, because they can definitely see the ROI. They understand the benefit at each stage or phase of the process, and I think that is very helpful, and that's exactly what I was hoping to get out of this conversation today. So thank you for that. Before we wrap up, can you help our listeners with resources and tools that may make implementation of some technologies easier, and what resources, and point out some of the resources that exist for planning and eventual implementation of a variety of different IoT solutions?
So the first resource I would say is the materials that you're going to be posting and
yes.
the links that you'll be posting. So I would like to remind folks that there will be information provided to give you a framework, at least, of some of these case studies and some of the options you have in front of you. For validation lifecycle management solutions, these documents include 4 case studies there that you can look at. Generously provided by Valgenesis. They're a validation lifecycle management solution provider. Not here to plug any particular one, but they did come through with these case studies. And
we thank them for that. That's helpful. Yeah, absolutely.
And full disclosure, I do provide some industry advice to them from time to time, so want to make sure that I make that clear as well.
Of course.
But more generally, for IoT platforms, there are a lot of service providers out there, depending on the aspect of your end-to-end supply chain that you would like to address. So again, my suggestion would be to consult a benchmark study. There are lots of really good ones out there. See how the IoT and manufacturing intelligence ecosystem is framed out by somebody who's gone before. There are certain pharmaceutical companies who are leading, but you can also go to petrochemicals and automotive and steel and really see how industries that have been using this for decades, what they've learned. And usually they will quite readily share their experience. They're
right.
To talk about it. So that is one big resource. And then once you've framed out a general vision and strategy, you can start evaluating your internal capabilities and then select the partner that will supplement what you don't have. And you can learn from those partners as you build your internal capability, because ultimately you want to own the ability to leverage these tools as much as possible and not be completely reliant on external. So those partnerships are really important. The IoT platform that you use ends up being the way of connecting across your enterprise. So once you have that in place, then it has to be connected to the data sources. This can be done through direct connections, through data historians, through a data cloud, a combination of all three. And then you can hang your data analytics tools that can be deployed as part of the IoT framework. You may have edge computing solutions that are down at the process level, but you may need some communication. You may have digital twin in the cloud. And ideally, you would have all of those things. So you may need different service providers and different solution expertise, depending on where you're working, how you framed out your strategy, and where you want to start, preferably solving some pain points and getting some real value right away.
Right. I think that's a great suggestion. I mean, I know you had mentioned it earlier on in this episode, or perhaps it was in the first half, but really understanding what your pain points are and then developing a solution to them sounds like a really easy way for people to get started in with the integration, with the technology integration. And something that provides a quick hit, like a positive right from the beginning, right?
Yes, and by taking that approach, you can prove the value as you and extract value as you go.
Right.
The things that prove successful, you can quickly replicate much more quickly and at a much lower cost than it takes to do the first case study. So, and if it fails, abandon it and move to something else that works.
Right, exactly.
Really design this. I would say design those modular things consistent with your overall vision and strategy. How are those things going to connect up in the ultimate ecosystem according to your vision and strategy? What you will end up, if you do a little bit of that planning up front, is you'll end up with an ecosystem that has much greater value than the sum of those parts. And we've already seen the parts can produce huge value. Right. Imagine the synergies you get when you pull all that together.
Yeah.
So it's really, I think, imperative to have a framework, a vision of where you want to go, and then jump in and start delivering some value.
Alton, that is amazing advice. And I thank you for sharing a lot of the resources. There are so many resources out there for folks. We'll share some of them, as you mentioned, in our show notes. But it seems to me there really is almost something for everyone in this industry, in the sense that you can start almost anywhere and see improvements. You just need to, as you mentioned in the first episode, jump in and get going.
Just start. Otherwise, the train will leave you behind and all those benefits won't be realized. So,
absolutely. Alton, thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your knowledge, your resources, and really giving great advice to our listeners. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the whole staff at Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you on that. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode. And then don't forget, share those with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. That does help us grow, and we do appreciate it. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.